Okay, this is going to be part two to chapter two. We left off last time talking about sort of the scientific approach and how the scientific approach is very good for being able to discover and learn about how the world operates, but it's not good. It is not able to answer our ethical and moral questions. That's something that we have to turn to other sources for, whether that be ethics, philosophy, religious traditions and perspectives, etc. And so that's a good thing to know right up front that the scientific approach, which we will take in this course, is not able to do everything. Now, the next section from the chapter that I thought was worth sort of highlighting in these notes was this Lawrence Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral development. Now, as I indicated before, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Let me just give you a general overview of this. You can see on the next slide that I've got several points, but let me not get into the specifics. You should make sure to know these terms, what Kohlberg means by pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional. And there's 2 levels within each one of those levels, but you don't need to get too much in the weeds. I don't think I'm going to ask any test questions quiz questions that get that specific. But anyway, the general point that I want you to understand from his research is that when we start out as little children, our understanding of right and wrong is very crude and undeveloped, unrefined, that we tend to think of good and bad when we're little in terms of, bad is what gets me into trouble, and good is stuff that I like, kind of a thing. So we start out very concrete and sort of crude sense of right and wrong. And as you grow up through your adolescent and into your adult years, you tend to get a more abstract view of right and wrong that's based on principles, that's based on sort of a broader perspective, and you end up in the end at the highest levels with these abstract philosophical or ethical principles of right and wrong. And that's the main story that Kohlberg is stressing. And of course that we want to educate folks so that they take a broader, more consistent, maybe philosophically grounded, view of ethics. So we're more sophisticated about it. One limitation that I will mention on this next slide here is that even though this is a kind of a famous approach to moral development, you've probably run across it before if you've taken psychology courses. But a criticism of this approach is you do tend to see something of a gender difference in this approach to morality, right and wrong, in that there's a tendency, now we don't overstate this, it's only a tendency for men to take a little bit more of this sort of cool, abstract, detached view of right and wrong. And you see in the research that women have a tendency to take a more caring approach. Morality is what helps people, is what cares for, results in caring for people as opposed to harm to people. So it can be a little bit of a gender difference there. And so that is a criticism that's made against Kohlberg's approach, that you have some gender differences and that maybe this abstract way of doing morality may not necessarily, be the best way or the only way, that there's mature, sophisticated ways to approach morality that may differ a little from that. So anyway, that's one criticism, challenge that Kohlberg's approach to morality takes. But you certainly see within our criminal justice system our laws, the logic, the ethics behind laws is that they do tend to take an abstract view of things. For example, equal rights for all, that regardless of who you are, that the rules, the laws should apply to you the same. That's a detached, kind of abstract way of thinking about right and wrong that the rules should apply exactly the same to everybody regardless, right? So that example of how this way of thinking is actually, you see it a lot in the criminal justice system. Let's move on to, excuse me, a section of this chapter, which is interesting, and it's one that you're probably not going to find in any other criminology courses, because this comes from political philosophy, and so in criminal justice we tend to focus on stuff that's a little more concrete, policies, laws, etc., that are a little more concrete. But this is kind of a nice big picture as we get going in the semester, a nice big picture way of looking at the way we approach laws, the way we approach right and wrong, and how we come down on these issues. And so I think it's a good thing to spend a little bit of time on, because it helps you learn kind of how you come down. Why is it that you have a certain view on the criminal law versus somebody else? To even get more specific, we'll use the example of legalization of marijuana throughout the country that's going on right now. We'll use that as an example more than once this semester, as an example of a relevant, contemporary, issue that's going on right now. The state of Montana has on the ballot this fall, the recreational legalization of marijuana, right next door, next state over, right? So this is a very relevant topic, but we're interested in is what leads a person to adopt one position versus another position, because if we can understand that, then we can make sure that our own views on things are well grounded and are thought through. So that's kind of what's behind this big philosophical approach to things. It doesn't seem very practical, but it actually does have a lot of impact on a lot of things. So let's get into this. It's useful to divide up people's philosophical approaches to, political issues, criminal justice issues, into two types of people. Just a one way of dividing things that's interesting. Idealists and pragmatists. An idealist point of view, these are folks who tend to evaluate actions and decisions based on how well they meet broad theoretical ideas. Now, that's not very specific, but to make it a little plainer, someone who's an idealist under this categorical, this system here of two different types, this is a person who has a philosophy that they follow to help them decide how they come down on an issue. Very often, the philosophy will take the form of sort of, ethical or very often sort of a religious perspective. But the point is, it doesn't have to be religious. It could be a purely sort of philosophical approach. But the point that they're making here is that the person who's an idealist has this big, outlook on things, philosophy that influences the way they look at so many different things. And they decide whether, for example, they want to legalize or not legalize recreational marijuana based on this big philosophy, this worldwide perspective that they have, this set of principles that they have from which they derive their opinions and their attitudes. So that's what they mean by idealist. A pragmatist, by contrast, this is someone the actions and decisions are evaluated based on empiricism or the analysis of data. Now, that's a little bit strong. Most of us don't have time to, analyze data in helping us determine, how we come down on these issues. But think of it a little bit more in more ordinary terms. Pragmatist means practical. So a pragmatist is somebody who doesn't have these big, broad principles. Or a big, philosophy that informs all of their opinions. A pragmatist is somebody who's just like, how does it really affect people? In real life, does it really make much of a difference? Is it something that's better to have, better not to have, better to tolerate and allow? And so it's people who are just sort of looking at it and say, what's the harm? Exactly what difference does it make, kind of a thing. So a person like that is practical, and they look at how things actually operate on the ground in real life, as opposed to drawing on these big principles. So for pragmatists, think practical. Idealists, think someone who's got a big philosophical, ethical, religious perspective that influences how they think. The public tends to focus on their values and common sense. Scholars, so the people who wrote your textbook, criminologists, students of the legal system, we're trained to follow the data more than anything else. So again, when you're taking the scientific approach, you're supposed to be focused on the facts, the data, the information, the how does, on this, for example, on this issue of legalization of marijuana, what are the facts of this issue, right? What are the facts on the ground? How does it, what is a state like that has legalized marijuana? What's a state like that doesn't have it? We need to collect all the facts carefully, wade through all those facts, and then sort of in a down to earth sort of way, figure out whether it seems like which way makes sense, right? Now, don't take this too far, because researchers have values too, and they have perspectives, and they have philosophies, and they have ethics, a sense of ethics, just like anybody else. So don't think that it's all about facts and data for scholars and researchers, because they're very passionate about their values, just like anybody else. So let's not take this too far. But the point that the textbook's trying to make is that the thing that would make we criminologists different than ordinary folks is just that a greater attention to the facts, to the data, to what do we really know about this, how much do we know, that kind of thing. And less, ordinary people don't have time for all that, so they just base it on what they've heard and what they've experienced, what they know in their own personal lives, etc. Okay, according to one view, we have justice if all people are in harmony. The idealist sees this as how things should be. The pragmatist just wants people to be satisfied. So the idealist, again, drawing on traditional kind of perspectives, looks for a peaceful, orderly, tranquil society where people are cooperative and get along with each other, and you have a peaceful society. The idealist tends to think in terms of big picture and that sort of thing. Whether the society sort of reflects, is consistent with these big principles of right and wrong or not. Whereas the pragmatist is more, I just want people to be happy, be satisfied, and whatever people want to do, sort of thing. If something is something that people like that, well, then that's fine with me. I'm just wanting people to be content and satisfied with things, and it's almost like a less ambitious approach where you're not thinking about right and wrong in a big sense, but just keeping people, as long as they're satisfied and content, then things are good. Then you have a just, good society, that sort of thing. Idealists believe that there's an ultimate truth that should be followed. The pragmatist just follows or focuses on problem solving. So here's a big difference, and I want you to know, for testing purposes, the differences, kind of like a little list of differences between idealists and pragmatists. So the idealist believes in an ultimate truth. Again, I think is a good way of thinking of this is think of this as like a religious person. Again, it doesn't have to be a religious person, but that's what you often see in real life. The people who are idealists are people who have a strong faith and a kind of a developed religious belief system. So a person like that is more likely to say, hey, that society should have laws, and members of society should behave in a way that's consistent with ultimate truth. There's ultimate right and wrong, and the more members of society are doing right and avoiding wrong, then you got a better society. That's the idealist point of view. The pragmatist, on the other hand, is just like, well, as long it's less ambitious than that. It's like as long as you don't have major problems, you got a good society, and let's go out and find out where the problems are and try to reform things, change things, so we fix those problems. And if you don't have too many problems, you got a good society. So it's kind of less ambitious and again, more practical. The idealist tends to focus on the welfare of the soul or the mind and considers the spiritual to be higher than the material world, while the pragmatist tends to focus on material, practical concerns. So this is a difference too. Again, these are just useful categories. It doesn't mean everybody fits into one box or the other one. It's just helpful to make us, help us think about things. So the idealist is more likely to think about the state of your inner life, your mind, your soul, your spirit, your psyche. So it could even be sort of a psychological thing. It doesn't have to be just like a spiritual thing, but it's looking at psychological or spiritual well-being in addition to material. The pragmatist is more likely, again, to be sort of down to earth. So they're looking at things like, well, how does it affect your health? Your physical health? How does it affect your safety, your security, physical safety, physical security? How does it affect your sort of financial situation, your economics and your money situation? So see, that's more what we mean when we say material, practical stuff, is those sorts of things versus spiritual or psychological. So again, the difference between the idealist and the pragmatist. Plato, one of the earliest Greek philosophers, he's a good example of an idealist. And he believed that material objects had a perfect spiritual form, and the closer the approximation to that form, the more perfect the object. So he thought that ultimate reality is really a spiritual thing, not a material thing, that this world that we live in is a little bit misleading, that we experience all these, all this physical world. And so that seems like the obvious real thing, but to Plato, an even deeper truth was that behind all of the physical is a spiritual, is an immaterial reality, and that's actually a higher reality, a pure reality. It's really the real, as opposed to this physical world that we live in. And so he saw that everything had sort of a perfect version of it. You had a human being to be you could have a perfect version of a human being, or whatever it is you're focusing on. There's a perfect version of that, and that what you see on Earth, what you see around you, is sort of imperfect variations of that fall short of the ideal, fall short of the spiritual perfect form of that, right? So that's kind of where some of this thinking comes from, is from thinkers like Plato. Idealists rely on what they call a priori thinking. What they mean by a priori is that judgment should be based on eternal principles. So it's kind of like you kind of come up with your answer before you even go study whatever it is that you're concerned about. So on the marijuana legalization issue, someone who's an idealist might take the position, well, listen, taking harmful substances into your body, or potentially harmful things, or taking in substances that alter your mental state, well, you shouldn't do that sort of thing. That's not proper for human beings. Human beings shouldn't be doing mind altering things and things that could be potentially damaging to a person's psyche and also their health and that sort of thing. So they might come up with the point of view where they're against legalization without actually going and finding out, well, what are the facts in places where it's legalized? What's it like there? Is it really so bad? Is it bad? How's it bad? Are there positives? That kind of stuff. So the idealist is more likely to kind of have a position without seeing how it actually operates in the world, because their positions are more likely to be based on principles and less on the reality of how it operates out there on the streets in the real world. The pragmatists are more likely to rely on what's called a posteriori reasoning, meaning that means after the fact. A priori means before the fact. A posteriori, it's a mouthful. Reasoning is after looking at the data, looking at the facts. Well, then how do you come down on this issue? Judgment should be based on carefully observed reality. So that's what the researchers do. The researchers tend to say, well, let's go really look at this stuff carefully and try to gather all the facts, and then what do the facts suggest, right? And not based on any big philosophical perspective, right? Anyway, so that's, again, a contrast between the two. Idealists see humanity as subject to transcendent rules. Pragmatists rely on people to figure out solutions for themselves. So you do see a pretty fundamental difference between these two categories. Idealists, again, think that there's an absolute right and wrong, that there's truth, that there's right and wrong, that transcends and goes beyond human beings. That even if you didn't have human beings on Earth, you still would have these principles of right and wrong. The pragmatist is more likely to see right and wrong as something that humans come up with. They decide what's right and wrong and go from there. And that they're basically human. It's up to humans to come up with solutions for themselves. That there's no transcendent principles that you can rely on, that you can draw upon to help you make your decisions. Idealists see transcendent values flowing from some sort of higher power. So that's the tendency anyway. It doesn't necessarily have to be God as we normally think of God. Plato, for example, who was an idealist, would have probably a very different view of this than, say, for example, a Christian might. But there is, among idealists, there is idea that there's something over and above humans that determines that is the source of right and wrong. And so consequently, they are central to any decision. So this idea is, if there is an absolute right and wrong out there, well, then we need to make our policies as much as possible consistent with those eternal, those overriding principles. The pragmatists rely on human intelligence to decide on value. So again, to the pragmatist, it's a human problem with human solutions, and there's not really these transcendent principles that we're going to fall back on to answer questions. Okay, the idealists see an underlying order in the universe, and our job is to get in harmony with that. So you have a good society if that society's behavior and laws are as consistent as possible with the order of the universe, with the right and wrong that's out there. Pragmatists tend to focus on the universe as we experience it, as we live it, and base our decisions on that. So you folks probably get the idea here of this difference between these two categories. Idealists think judgment should be made based on a view that goes beyond death. Pragmatists want to make decisions based on this observable life. So it's, again, the pragmatists are here and now. Idealists are big picture. And they're concerned with not only our lives here at this moment, but what happens after we're gone. What happens to future generations, what happens again, big picture. Now, here's an important term you want to make sure and be familiar with: paradigm. This is a philosophical worldview held by individuals that help them make decisions. So a synonym for a paradigm would be like a worldview, philosophy, a certain outlook that you have that helps you filter through things and make sense out of your world. Another paradigm is also thought of as being sort of a model of how you look at things. Many of the disagreements people have over criminal justice issues have to do with whether a person has an idealist or a pragmatist or pragmatic paradigm. So are you someone who is more practical, or someone who's more principled and kind of has this big perspective, theoretical, in the way you approach problems? And this final point from this chapter is that the bottom line for the pragmatist typically is, and you'll see this theme come up again and again as we talk about criminal law throughout the semester, that for the pragmatist, the bottom line question is often, okay, when it comes to crime, whether we want to make something criminal, prohibit it, what's the real harm that's done? If there's real harm that's done, substantial, severe, serious harm, well, then we want to criminalize it. But if nobody really gets hurt, if the harm is minimal, then maybe it's something that, even if we don't like it, that we might want to tolerate it. live with it if people like that activity, right? So keep that in mind. We'll talk more about these sorts of differences in future chapters. They get into it even more in chapter 3, even though I won't take it as far as they do. But one thing I'd like to ask you here at the end of this chapter to think about, again, as an opportunity to learn a little bit more about yourself, is that if you were forced to identify yourself as being in one category or the other, idealist or pragmatist, which would you pick? How would you come down on that? Because that's an interesting question. Again, you may not be purely one way or the other, but if you were forced into one category, which one would you go with? The pragmatist, the practical, or the more big picture person who draws on principles, the idealist? So look at that, and it may help you understand better why you take the opinions you take on different kinds of issues. So we'll continue that on, as I say, in chapter 3.